Impact assessment of heritage for heritage is as important. So these are the actions that we can take, and I think the government, the finance minister announced Desh in the last budget, which is really a national mission for promoting heritage and tourism in the country. As we grow, we must be ready to manage that visitor capacity for each of the places that we're in. And last slide, really, to talk about heritage is not our past, it is really our doorway into the future.
The impact memory has on monuments, on people, on communities and on localities. It is skill. It is the knowledge that they had, which in our country, a lot of it is the oral tradition, the Guru Shagir system of passing down through tradition, through honing of skills. The memory of tradition.
A very good afternoon to everyone present here, and greetings to my speakers for this afternoon. This discussion, when I heard the title of Monuments, Memory and Modern India, it really resonated with me because of the work I do in Bhavnagar. And when I found out what a stellar list of speakers is going to be there, it was but obvious that I had to be part of this in some way. So without taking much time in boring you all with my rants, I would like to invite Ms. Malini ji to start with her presentation and give us all the insights on the work that you're doing, please. Thank you.
So I work for the World Monuments Fund in India, and I love the line that we use currently, which is safeguarding the irreplaceable. And that's been the mission of the organization, and I hope it continues forever, because the irreplaceable is irreplaceable, and it is, I think, not just our job, but the job of everyone in this room and outside too, to safeguard it for memory and for the future, for future generations to learn from and to cherish and to enjoy. So actually, I was delighted that there was this panel and there was this discussion on memory and monuments and the future, because really, so it is a legacy from the past, but really something that we leave for the future. So what we conserve today actually defines what we pass on. And heritage is an intergenerational equity. It is not something that is ours to hold and to control, but it is something for us. We are custodians for something that will carry on into the future as well and inform future generations too. So I think it's very important that we memorize that, because that's really critical. So just a little spiel about ourselves. Can't start without that. World Monuments Fund, 60-year-old organization, started in the US, but has a footprint across Europe, Peru, in Latin America, many projects in Africa, in Bahrain, in India, and most recently in China as well. In India, we're a not-for-profit, started 11 years ago, and we worked on several projects across the country, 4 themes that we're working on. And each of those actually has to do with monuments, but each of them has to do with memory and the future. So climate adaptation is upon all of us. It's something that impacts communities, it impacts people, but equally it impacts monuments and buildings and the heritage that surrounds those monuments as well. So that's climate adaptation and water. Are very critical. So 2 of the themes in India that we're working on is historic water systems. So we've got now about 12 to 15 stepwells and water bodies that we are restoring in different parts of the country. Most recently, we've started a project, in fact, in your neighborhood, in Safdarjung, where we're restoring after studying the of Safdarjung gardens, and we're going to transform them again back to the Mughal gardens that they once were, but also continue to layer them with the recent heritage that was constructed and built in the gardens there, which is the British legacy as well. So we're making sure that we memorialize what was there on this ground, but at the same time make it climate friendly so that we can try and ensure that these gardens remain to be enjoyed by future generations as well. So we're trying to future-proof these gardens as well with, water harvesting and, and using, so plants that are endemic and yet can be used for the future, are hardy enough to withstand future changes. So that's the kind of work that we're doing. Adaptive reuse, I think, is a much used term, but I'm glad that it is increasingly being used and reused, so that there are old monuments that are not just khandar, but these are monuments and buildings and infrastructure that can be reused in many different ways, often in the same way that they were meant to be, but even otherwise in different ways that can make them usable for the current and also so going into the future as well. Sustainable tourism is something that the whole country is talking about, the government's talking about, and we're focusing on that, and I'm glad that we are, because there are many issues there. And I'm delighted that one of the projects that we completed in Mumbai a couple of years ago is the Afghan Church, which was this forgotten church in one corner of South Bombay, which we've restored, brought it back to life. There are people going in there to worship. There are people going in there for musical performances. There are people going in there for events that are held in the gardens. So we've just helped to revitalize that district, and I'll talk about some more such examples going ahead as well in this presentation. So we are a heritage superpower. We don't recognize that. We have sadly only 3,000 protected monuments. There should be many, many more, but that's a lot to start with too. We're number 6 globally on the UNESCO list of heritage sites. This is really an untapped heritage economy, which I'm glad that we're looking to grow into the future as well. The real challenges that lie ahead are really the pressures of urbanization. There is the land economics that we've all seen at play in each one of our cities and urban environments. Maintenance gaps. There's no point in restoring a building and not looking after it after. And that's something that we have to address. And there is a stress of tourism. I think while the number of foreign visitors to India declined last year, the number of domestic tourists increased manyfold. So I think, if I remember right, there were about 16 million foreign visitors who came in 2025, and there were 85 million domestic tourists. So that's a huge number that's growing. So we've got to be ready for that. Jaipur is a case study. I think we've all seen Jaipur in the papers. Jaipur's already under threat of losing its UNESCO title because there has been deviations from traditional norms of a heritage city or of heritage space, and that's something that Jaipur has been given time till December to address and to redress. But these are the challenges of places which can get branded as heritage places, but need to maintain those very, very rigidly if they want to continue to be celebrated as such. And these are things that are being addressed. So I don't want to go into the details of this. The huge opportunity is Mumbai. Now, Mumbai, all of us know, is a city for business, is a city for commerce, but very few people think of going there as a tourist destination. But Mumbai's got, I think, is the second largest collection of Art Deco buildings after Miami. And no one really knew that, but it's now on the UNESCO list as well. We've got Victorian Gothic. There's a whole precinct which was under wraps right now when the metro was being built. The whole DN Road Fort area was under folds, but it's been reopened now, and I hope it's going to be revived. And adaptive reuse is something that has been, has been really experimented with really well in Bombay. So the Kala Ghoda Festival. So this was started about 20 years ago. And I can say with a little bit of pride that I was among the first people at that time, 20 years ago, that helped to create this Kala Ghoda festival. But what it did was that it revitalized a very, very decrepit neighborhood. At that time, I remember I lived in Bombay. You were scared to drive past that place because it was full of a lot of low life. Now, it's got restaurants, it's got places of entertainment, it's got life at night that comes in there for entertainment, for also to enjoy the different styles of heritage that have been built in that place over the last 250 years. So it's completely revitalized, and that's a great case study. Corporate partnerships, corporates are in fact playing a huge role in this revitalization as well. So there's a case for that. International lessons, there are plenty, there are several. Florence protects the character of the city, but not just its buildings alone. Barcelona does urban heritage management very well. Dubrovnik used to have millions of people coming in to visit every year, but now they've started controlling crowds because they do realize that there is damage to the city and to their heritage by allowing too many people in. So crowd control, capacity management is very, very critical. Kyoto even recommends visitor behavior. So it's not just come and see my city, but behave yourselves while you're there. Penang, Georgetown, close to us, is an economic resurgence of, an example of economic resurgence in a heritage district. So lots of great examples. What do we learn from these? So there is really 4 C's, and everyone loves these lists and numbers. So conservation, very important. Community is critical. If you don't bring the community along and be part of that community, you will fail. So the community is critical. Commerce, very important. There has to be an economic advantage for the community and for the neighborhood for it to thrive. And the carrying capacity, again, very, very critical. You cannot have more people in a place than it will permit. You have to be very, very mindful. Otherwise, like so many other places which are endangered now by being delisted, you too can lose that position if you don't focus on managing the visitors who come. So how do you bring communities into partnership? Now, Jaipur, again, great example. You've got the Pink City Tours, which is a 3-wheeler scooter company run by 50 women. And it's a self-help group, and they do a great job. They take you around in the 3-wheelers. They're also tour guides. And now that example is being taken up in other cities as well. So they're going to be opening branches. So these are entrepreneurs now. This is the community that has tapped into heritage as a vein, but is an entrepreneur. And they're going to other cities as well with their example. And I read in the papers, while Pune city is not taking them as partners, but they're following the same example as well. So they're leading by example. So youth heritage groups, there are so many, even in Delhi, you have so many young people, students of history, of architecture, of heritage, who take people on walks around the city. I mean, this city abounds with those. And like that, you have groups around the country as well. Storytelling, such a critical part of heritage and of community and of tourism. Because if you don't know the story behind the monument, you're not going to be able to really appreciate what it is. And then there is an opportunity for craft clusters as well, because India has the wealth of craft which no other country can boast. So these clusters are an integral part of our heritage story, and we must celebrate those as well. What's needed? Policy shifts. And I can see that it's a good thing that that's already happening. So you have heritage and master plans, very necessary. Tax and incentives to be given to the sector. Public-private models should come into play. Again, I keep repeating visitor caps, that's critical. And impact assessment of heritage for heritage is as important. So these are the actions that we can take. And I think the government, the finance minister announced Desh in the last budget, which is really a national mission for promoting heritage and tourism in the country. Skills development, there are so many skills that are forgotten that we must remember and we must take forward into the future. Data platforms will give us information about what to do, how to do it, and when to do it, and where. Climate plans, again, I've banged on about that enough. And again, I repeat, visitor systems, very, very important. So as we grow, we must be ready to manage that visitor capacity for each of the places that we're in. And last slide, really, to talk about heritage is not our past. It is really our doorway into the future, as I see it. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Malini ji. I think the World Monuments Fund is doing a lot of work in India. I keep following things via social media, and I did mention that, I had the pleasure of visiting the Afghan Church when they had the opening post-restoration. And as someone who's grown up in Bombay, I had never been to that side of town. I had never seen the Afghan Church. And as a student of culture and heritage, I was quite disappointed with myself at the end of it, because it's really a beautiful, beautiful space. The church itself, the stained glass, and the entire gardens and area, I think there's so much more that can be done instead of limiting something for religious purposes. So I think that was something that World Monuments Fund has done beautifully. And I know you're doing a lot of work with stepwells, which I'll get to as we start the questions. Before that, I would like to invite Anuradha ji, please, to present your panel for us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you first for the organizers, especially for Tupreet, for inviting us today. And it's wonderful to be with Malini, whom I know, and Brijeshwari, whom I've met now. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. So the topic of our discussion is monuments, memory, and modern India. And I've tried to resist the temptation of talking about my work, but just use stories and examples from what I do to highlight this. And then, just to be difficult, end with a series of questions for everyone just to think about, because I think there's so much more that's unanswered than what is answered, and so much more to think about, really, especially where we are right now. So the first project that I'm going to use examples from is the Chowmahalla Palace, which I've had the privilege of working for the past 20 years. In fact, it was this project and the work on it that brought me back to India from the United Kingdom, where I was working for about 11 years. And the first thing I did at the palace was this exhibition. It's a gallery called the People and Places Gallery. The people were the Nizams of Hyderabad, and the places are the places in Hyderabad. So to connect the places or the monuments that were constructed, the buildings that were made by the Nizams to the city. So everybody knew what these buildings were, so we could route them. There was no such exhibition in the palace prior to this, so it gave a good opportunity to do this. And while doing this exhibition, of course, as a designer, as a curator, you're looking at how many photographs can fit in the wall, what is the height, what are the pictures, what can I put together. But one day, soon after the exhibition had opened, there was a rickshaw-puller who came into the exhibition, and he brought his little grandson with him. And I just sort of, out of curiosity, went and asked him, so why did you come here and why did you bring your grandchild? And he said, I want him to see what this mohalla or locality looked like when I was his age. Now that really resonated with me because I realized the impact that you can have, the impact memory has on monuments, on people, on communities, and on localities. So how is it that one photograph meant so much to one man that he chose to bring his grandson to see this gallery? Perhaps, the ticket of 50 rupees was too much for him, but still it meant enough for him to bring his grandchild there. Similarly, at the same gallery, we were also deciphering this 18th century map. It dates from 1763, and it was a map of which we didn't know then. It was just a map in a very bad condition that was conserved and put together so that we could put it on the wall. And it took a team of all these people you see in the photograph to decipher first what it was. So it was a combined wisdom of place, because it turned out that it was the map of Hyderabad-to-Bombay, the sites of the second Nizam's campsites that he had. But anybody would have read the map either starting from the top left or, if it's an Urdu or a Persian map, you start from the top right. But this map started at the bottom right of the page of this big manuscript, went to the top and came all the way down. So on the bottom right of the map, you were in Bombay, and the bottom left of the map, you were in Hyderabad. So it was confusing for anybody anyway, but it took people who had traveled by car from Hyderabad to Bombay to know the route, or the old Bombay highway route. It took people who knew Farsi, the old classical Farsi, to be able to decipher the names and what it said. And it took somebody also from the head from the archives who had seen manuscripts like this to think of ways in which it could be deciphered and what it could mean. So it was collective memory that put the reading of this map together. And this gentleman whom you see here sitting very grandly in the Howdah, one day, he and his name is Khan Saab, he was passed on now, and his friend Vittal, both of them came to the palace and said, our grandfathers used to work here, restoring the buggies and the Howdahs, and we would now like to do the same, because our children don't do this anymore. Their children were doctors and engineers and all part of the IT world. And we could help you restore them. So they did it using all the old techniques, and they still work. And if any of you have been to the Taj Falaknuma in Hyderabad, it is their buggies that are restored by them that are functioning and running there today. So it is so much of what they learned. They were both illiterate, but it is skill. It is the knowledge that they had, which in our country, a lot of it is the oral tradition, the Guru Shagird system of passing down through tradition, through honing of skills. The memory of tradition, the skill of somebody teaching someone how to do stucco in lime. This is, we can learn all of this in a university education, but until you know the material, you own it, you understand it, you can never be an expert at it. So this is really what I wanted to say about monuments memory and modern India in the Chowmahalla context. That this is a monument, the Nizam's palace, that was once open only to a select few, but today serves as a public museum. So it's been democratized. It is a repository for the collective memory of the people of Hyderabad, and it provides a platform for traditional skills and craft forms, keeping them relevant in modern India. The next example that I'm going to talk about is the Domkunda Fort. It's about 100 kilometers north of Hyderabad, and it was a very rural setting. And in fact, when I started first visiting the place in 2011, we used to have somebody from the Friends of Snake Society who would be walking 10 steps ahead, and we'd carry like a whole box full of snakes with us. And then we'd release them in the forest on the way home, because it was like, nobody had been to the site. It was kind of abandoned. There was no protection for the site. The walls were protected of the fort, but the structures within them were not. And part of the conservation philosophy, which we had to devise because of the lack of protection or lack of rules for them, was to involve the local community as much as possible, to use local materials and techniques, and to revive forgotten traditions and arts, and which go beyond the architectural fabric. Now, this was what was devised before we started the work, but it turned out that it was not as simple as we thought, because where do you get the materials from? Who knows about the materials? Who knows about the techniques? Who uses these techniques? When everybody is building new concrete homes, who knows how to use lime? Who knows what are the recipes that go into lime? So there were a lot more questions than answers, and it was much tougher than we thought, and it took 10 years to finish this project. But the materials had to be brought locally, simply because it was a rural site. It was not as simple as just going to the market and getting building materials. We really had to figure out how we were going to get them to site, and of course, reduce the cost of transportation, which was also something that the clients were keen on doing. So it involved really speaking to members of the community, of going into the village, talking to them, and very often talking to the older generations to sort of ask, where did they get their materials from? Where did the lime come from? Where did the bricks come from? What did they use instead of floor tiles? Where was the stone? And we managed to find that the bulk of the building material came from about 25-kilometer radius off the site. So the bricks, the granite, and the tiles came from 25 kilometers away. We even revived old brick kilns, and they were very happy to do that because they found a job. They found something that was giving them livelihood again, because otherwise they were all working in other parts of the state. The sand came from the nearest, legal sand mining place in Bodan. And we had to come to Hyderabad to get certain additives that go in lime, like karakaya and jaggery, which are available in the Unani and the Ayurvedic stores, which we also use in the lime. And furthest away came the lime from the lime mines in Andhra and the timber from Balarshah in Maharashtra. So it was wherever we could get the materials of the quality that was desired as close to the site as possible. So in the end, it also turned out to be a very sustainable and a green project, because we had a very minimal carbon footprint. So again, heritage work is not really something which is in the past. It's not something which is, oh, so pretty, it should be in a museum. No, it's not. It has relevance today. So while the world is talking about green building systems, negating carbon, reducing the embodied energy of any buildings, well, our traditional buildings did just that. And it took this whole exercise for us to see that it is possible to achieve the best possible results for a project, and which will be relevant in the future, and also is authentic in the sort of repair that is being undertaken. This is just some of the pictures of the various processes we had, from the lime to the experimentation with color to using egg white in the lime plaster, and essentially in all the processes together also involve the community. So various people do different jobs on the project, making it a collective building exercise, not just an individual one. We also conducted workshops where we didn't have the skill. So here we had people from Jaipur come and teach an infusion of color, because one of the things I found is that when we use synthetics in lime, the lime rejects them. So the synthetic pigments in lime, like the red oxide that you buy in a shop, would turn from geru color, which is terracotta. It would become yellow, pink, green, anything other than the color that it was supposed to be. So it was like the lime is telling you something, is telling you, I don't like this stuff, I don't want synthetics. So if it didn't like the synthetics, what did it like? It liked the natural pigments, whether it was stone-based, whether it is, mostly stone really is what we used, some earth, we also did use ochre. But we didn't know how to use it. So here, on the top left, that is the vermilion that is used in the Hanuman temples. But we use that to stain the lime and use that in the flooring, on the walls. And that's kind of stood the test of time. It's been about 11 years now since we finished the project. And also what I want to show is that the people who are doing this, it's not like they were taught on a PowerPoint presentation. They were taught sitting there, touching the material, learning to use it, never having used it before. This is load-bearing jali wall construction that now our craftsmen locally have really mastered. This is a graph that over 10 years, it was a tiresome exercise, I won't say otherwise, but how we had to train the locals to do the work, because initially we couldn't find anybody. And when we did find them, they had not practiced, so they didn't know what to do. And everybody was keen to impress, so they wanted to use shortcuts. So when we said we wanted a sheen on the wall on the Araish, it was like, "Madam, thoda plastic paint laga do." I'm like, no plastics. So it took a lot for us to almost get them to unlearn what they were doing wrong and relearn it. So it would be constant rejection of the work till they got it right, until they knew that, it was really their skill that had to be at its best for any of the work. And in 10 years' time, we've managed to now create a complete team who works with me on other projects as well now. But they have learned by hard work and by experimentation, getting it wrong till you get it right. I'm just showing you some of the buildings that they have done, the locals. I'm not showing you buildings of the fort that were done by the expert craftsmen, but this is the smaller buildings that we handed over to the locals. They were just, and some of them were just unskilled labor, but they were trained on the project and they managed to conserve these buildings. So that was the condition of these buildings before they touched it. And then on the right is after. These were the two kacheris or the offices within the fort complex. The top photograph is the Bijli Khana. And the bottom one is a house of one of the caretakers previously. But these are not the main buildings. We gave them the smaller buildings to do. But the more they did it, the happier they felt, because it gave them a sense of pride. And you can visually see what you've done. At the same time, they also honed their skills. So it's like a hath safai ka kam, so that they were practicing and they were getting better at what they were doing. And the other thing was, there was also a master craftsman on the lime stucco. And initially I would draw out 1:1 drawings of all the stucco for this building within the fort and gave him the stencil to work out and do and execute it. But I saw, was very reluctant. He refused to use a stencil. He refused to stick to the drawings. And then the penny dropped and I realized that he was an artist and I'm trying to make a craftsman out of an artist, which is wrong. And so we sat down and I said, right, look, this is the theme of the building. I won't give you a stencil. Will you do it right? And he said, yes, I will. And then it was about us having this discussion and talking like you would to an artist and saying, how would you want to do this work? This is my idea. Then he would say what he would like. I would say what was acceptable. And in the end, we reached this very happy balance of working to achieve something which we both wanted, of course, to be the best for the building. And this is a Penli Bhavanti, which in Telugu means a place for weddings. And the art, the stucco, is derived from a building that was done heavily inspired by Persian architecture next door within the complex of the site. But he put in details like you can see at the bottom here, it's like a kalash, which is symbolic of weddings in India. And that is the dome, the ceiling that was done up, again, completely in lime. And it took a good 2 years to finish the whole building, but everything was done extremely meticulously with a guide, but not with a stencil. So coming to this, the fort is an unprotected monument. To keep the spirit of the place intact, a conservation philosophy had to be formulated at the outset. Through the collective memory of the owners, the villagers and stakeholders, the materials and techniques could be revived and documented, keeping alive nearly forgotten traditions. The involvement of the local community has ensured that they take ownership of their heritage and has prompted them to restore other unprotected structures like the old school, community halls and civic spaces in the village and beyond. This is modern India. And finally, I'm talking about a project which I wouldn't even call it a project. It was something which I was involved with only peripherally. It was the Maulali Kaman, which is a kaman which is the gateway to a dargah in Sikandarabad. So that's the dargah up on the hill, and it is protected. It's part of a conservation area of Sikandarabad as well. And it dates from the Qutub Shahi time, which is about at least 400 years old. And the Nizams also patronized it. And at the background of this photograph, you see this archway where the procession is coming out of. Now, this is how it's looked on a rainy day in August 2006 when I was driving past this area. And I found a lorry deliberately ramming into this gateway to tear it down. And the reason they were doing it is because it was a main highway and it was getting in the way of traffic or slowing traffic down. I was appalled. I'd just come back. I was still in the UK. I was back on a holiday and extremely disturbed by what was happening. I called up the archaeology department. There was no response. So I called up the local Urdu newspaper and said, this is happening. Is there anything we can do? So they said, yes, send us the photographs of what is going on and we'll see what we can stop. And we called up the local police and asked them to stop the work immediately. And the next day it appeared in the newspaper on the front page. And one of the people who read it was an old gentleman who grew up in this area. He was from this region and he had become a lawyer. He retired as a lawyer. And he said, I've read your article and I'd like to file a PIL. And can you help me do it and give me all the technical information that is required? So I said, of course. And we drafted it together. He did all the work. I only gave him all the little technical help. And single-handedly, this man managed to save the arch. So the archaeology department was forced to accept that there was a mistake. The municipal corporation, the GHMC, put in about 40 lakhs to restore the Kaman. And that's it today. So they've put these little barricades everywhere, including along the base of the arches to protect it. And the point I want to make is that sometimes, even if it is legally protected, a building, does this belong to us as a community? Our heritage belongs to us collectively. And if it could take one man to just stand up and say, this is mine, I grew up here, I have a connection to it, I want to save it, and he could do it, then how much can we save? Because after all, we are connected to the places that we grew up in, or we have, for whatever reason, we have an emotional connect with. People say that when I talk about emotional connect, or when I talk about places that it makes you feel a certain way, that it doesn't really add up to the hard facts. Well, actually, it does. And there was a very significant study by a UK-based company called Gallup, which they did with the Knight Foundation for 3 years between 2008 and 2010, where they had about 43,000 people participate in the study and found that there was a significant relationship between emotional attachment to a place and to the local GDP growth. The study was called The Soul of the Community, and it proved statistically that the softer side of a city, which is its beauty and history, is a primary driver for its hard economic success. So I think this is really something which makes you think that it's not really about being soft and only soft, but the soft really informs the hard decisions. And this is where I would like to leave with some questions for thought. I don't have all the answers, of course. On memory, we often talk of historic monuments and modern India as a continuum of a chronological timeline. In reality, they are the same fabric. Our old exists together with the new. So how do we balance them? Skill. Now, this is something which really struck me. Only 2% of our artisans are formally trained. The remaining 98% receive their knowledge and expertise through their gurus, rooted in oral tradition and memory, and not through AI and computer skills. How do we protect this tradition? And with regard to the protection itself, I think Malini also mentioned this. ASI protects 3,686 monuments as of today. Of these, Uttar Pradesh has 734 and Telangana has only 8. How does that work? According to the Niti Aayog, there are nearly 500,000 heritage structures. This means that less than 1% of India's built heritage is protected nationally. Who protects the unprotected majority? And who's really protecting the protected? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anuradha ji. It's I've not really explored Hyderabad, but I feel like I got a glimpse of that entire sort of geography through all the work that you're involved with. And that sort of really made me think, because in Bhavnagar we have this photographer, and he shares a photograph every day of something or the other and calls it a Good Morning Bhavnagar message. And his group sort of grew so exponentially during the COVID pandemic that he started an entire community group on WhatsApp. So every morning at around 8 a.m., we're all bombarded with this photograph, and it really makes you think and question. And usually it's a photograph of Bhavnagar and the surroundings. Sometimes there's sites that I've not been to, and then I see that picture, and I start thinking about that site in a different way through that photograph. So when you spoke about the gentleman who actually helped safeguard heritage, it really brought me to this story where he sent a picture of this beautiful heritage site in Bhavnagar, and it was built as a monument of love. It took 16 years to be built, designed by this British architect, the then principal of JJ College, Bombay, Sir John Griffith. And it sort of, in a way, kind of tries to be like the Taj Mahal, maybe a mini Taj Mahal. And it was his photograph where it showed that the monument's in horrible condition. It's got these branches kind of breaking the marble apart. And it was his photograph that sort of started this entire media sensation, I would say, about restoring that structure. And it was a state-protected monument. And it's taken about 3-4 years now. And it's actually, they've just finished the first phase of restoration. So my question to you, based on this entire exercise, is that, of course, in this instance, there was agreement in terms of stakeholders, where you talk about who owns heritage. What does one do when there is contestation in terms of ownership of heritage? What happens to that monument then?
I think that is a constant debate that happens, like, all the time. Unfortunately, more often than not, it is the heritage doesn't always win. Let's put it that way. It takes a lot. That's why these are isolated case studies like what I showed you. There have been a few in Hyderabad, like and I speak largely from the Hyderabad perspective. There was a landmark case of the Eramanzil Palace, which was it was a palace of one of the greater nobles of Hyderabad, but used as the electricity department. And they the new government that came in delisted it, and they said this is no longer a protected monument. So somebody again went to court and said, how can you say something is listed and protected, and how do you then suddenly say that it is not a heritage building? So how is something heritage one day and not one day, just because governments change? So in one of a landmark case, the Chief Justice Chauhan, this was in 2019 or 20, just around COVID, he said, no, if something is a heritage building, it is always a heritage building. You cannot decide when to take it, you protect it and not to protect it. So that has served as a guide for policy, for legislation. Unfortunately, what happens I think for us, the biggest problem is in urban India again, what is protected. There are greater, pressures on to not protect them, like the value of the land in cities, the FSI. So if somebody takes down a heritage building, they can use the greater piece of land for construction. You can go higher, you can make bigger buildings, they can become commercial. So it is this sort of the balance which is always very, very difficult to find. And I think even when it does come to the protection, at some point, the civic society has to stand up, because it is our heritage in the end,
I fully agree with what Anu said. And there are, in fact, in Mumbai, the example of Khotachi Wadi, for example. So it's a very, very tiny pocket. You're familiar with Khotachi Wadi? A tiny pocket of East Indian Goan, sort of residents who have lived there for the last 200 years, built this community, which is under threat from the building lobby, because I think there used to be some 80 bungalows or houses in that community, which are now down to only 12. And, so people have come in, new structures have come into the place, and there is no conservation, there is no protection for this environment. It's not listed. And yet it is a very important part of the city's history, and it is being forgotten. But the community plays a big role as well. Like you mentioned, this one lawyer who helped you save, a gateway. Like that, the community has to come in, and this collective memory that we have, we've got to really awaken that and make sure that we do collect and safeguard our heritage through our own actions. Because, once we've lost the place, it's forgotten, and it will only remain in the memory of our grandparents, and then it'll be gone.
Like the man bringing his grandchild to see the photograph.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also, I'd just like to add one thing, is that I think we need to have overall also something which our governments have not done so far. There has been talk about it, and some cities do it, but to have financial incentives for private owners of properties, of public, of heritage buildings. So like incentive on property tax reduction, or, something like that.
No, absolutely. You're very correct. I think in Ahmedabad, they had this in the old fortified part of the city before Ahmedabad got the UNESCO tag. They incentivized the people who were living in the houses there to start small businesses, be it in hospitality or in F&B, so that they are incentivized. They're paying, low interest rate loans, for example, so that they're incentivized to create something, homestays with their properties, and actually not just pull them down and, create these monstrosities.
I think another good example of this, and where work can be done, is in fact the Marine Drive in Mumbai, which is Art Deco, and it is the largest collection of Art Deco buildings in the world, after perhaps Miami and I think Sao Paulo in Brazil. But the ownership is fragmented. There is no incentive, and I think it's a very good point you make, that there should be some incentive for heritage to be maintained and to be restored and conserved as well. And if, for example, we can do that even in a small stretch of Marine Drive, you will have it's a world, it is already a world, it's a UNESCO site, but it will be conserved that much better, and it will look much better, because right now it's quite different. So every building has its own period of restoration and repair, and there are some buildings that look awful and need a huge amount of repair, and some buildings that are pristine. And in fact, 2 or 3 new buildings have snuck in without permissions, and they are allowed to remain there as well.
I think I've noticed one of those that you're referring to. But when we speak of listed monuments versus heritage as a whole, as a community, how does the World Monuments Fund, I think this is a question that's always been on my mind, how does the World Monuments Fund in India decide what monument to protect and sort of prioritize that?
That's a very tough question to answer, and something that we're exercised with on a daily basis. What do we take up, and what can we take up, and what should we let go? And I think I would not like to let go of anything that comes to mind. But first of all, it has to be for us, as an organization, we only work with places that are public, that are fully accessible to public. And you mentioned, so bringing Hyderabad heritage open to, so which was selectively, accessible, now open to the public. We work only with those places, in those places which will be open to the public. That is the first thing. The relevance of the place, the historic significance of the place also plays a part. The funds available. And of course the necessary permissions and the partnerships with the stakeholders, starting with government, with state departments of archaeology, of heritage, or the ASI, those also play a very important role. So all these elements are are balanced, and then we are able to decide what to do and what to let go for the moment.
So we're seeing a lot of, World Monuments Fund is doing a lot of work with public buildings which are open to people, and we're seeing a lot of interest in, I think, heritage and tourism as a whole, especially in India. I think post-pandemic, there have been more people traveling, Indians traveling within India than there have been abroad, through a lot of statistics. So I mean, on social media, I see a lot of these Instagram videos and reels of people posing next to monuments, some of them almost falling into a stepwell without knowing the actual history of the place or the sanctity of it for the community around it at times. So how does one deal with those kind of issues? Because at one point you want people to come to that space. You want that public awareness and attention, but at what cost? How do you balance that?
It's my favorite theme. Crowd management, carrying capacity. But I think, there are a couple of interconnects over here. So the first, I think very important, that we have to take pride in what is ours. We have to own it, and we have to really love it for us to want to maintain it, to look after it, and to retain it. So pride, information, education, and you talked about social media. There are increasingly a number of sites that talk about history, and I do hope that at some point, young people will make that connect and they will look up, a place. So, for example, we've restored Rajon Ki Baoli in Mehrauli, and again, so many Instagram posts of people posing in the place. But equally, there are now people, making documentaries, small documentaries about the history of the place, and I've seen that on social media as well. So I think that is good, that there is an awakening of knowledge and curiosity. And once that curiosity awakens, you will have ownership and pride. And I think that's critical to make sure that these places get remembered correctly and well.
No, absolutely. I think when we speak of ownership and pride, of course, it's the tourists, but it's also the local community staying around that site. And Anuradha ji, in your presentation, you were mentioning that a lot of local crafts, there aren't a lot of skilled local craftsmen in these regions and in these areas. I've seen the same in Bhavnagar, and I keep trying to understand the way local materials work with the local temperatures and the environment in comparison to just cementing everything without really using basic logic at times. But how do you incentivize artisans who probably families have been doing this craft and skill for generations but are slowly sort of fizzling out of it, maybe just looking for better opportunities financially at times? How do you incentivize them to come back to that?
See, art needs patronage. And without patronage, it cannot survive. And I have tried, like even for the workshops that we conducted, starting from there, I got even my painter from home to come and say, come and learn how to put color in Araish and do Araish. And he said, why would I do that? And I said, I'll pay you. And he said, no, I don't want to come all the way to learn something. I'd rather use that money to be at work. I said, okay, I'll double your wages. So then he came. So and at the same time, there was another story during COVID. Somebody who did exquisite painting on Bidri, he decided he didn't want to work anymore. And he said, I would never ever pick up my paintbrush again because my art has not given me bread and butter. So it's very deep, that question, because it's not about giving an incentive. It's about constantly giving them patronage. If their work as and again, I'm speaking from a real life story of this man who was probably one of the last two painters who would do on a miniature painting on a Bidri box, which is very hard to do, and he would earn. And there are one or two probably the whole state, if not handful in the country. But he earned more as a security man for a bank than he did doing his craft. Now, why would he do that? And if people say, oh, this is something this is not in fashion today. So it really requires everybody to collectively come together to realize that this is very precious. It is something which is finite. It's going to finish if we don't do something with it. So if it is like all of us saying, no, I would rather buy this than go to IKEA and buy a whatever wall cabinet or something, then you're giving him the reason to work. So it's not about somebody giving a one-time incentive like the government giving a discount on removing I think the GST has now been removed, or is it 2% or 5% on 5%? So if it is 5%, it's not about that. It's about the GSTs come down, but what about the actual work? So all of us together as a country, as a community, we have to give them patronage. We have to say, I believe in you. I believe in local craft. I believe in doing this work. And once you do that, then it will revive. It's not a one-time solution.
That's correct. Actually, there was this very talented carpenter who I had the pleasure of observing and working with while I was in Nepal. And I asked him, I said, how did you learn this craft? Because his measurements and the technicalities, you could just tell that the work was just phenomenal. And he said, मैं आपको 3 शब्द में बोलूँगा. He's from Gorakhpur, but he was living in Lumbini. He's like, मैं आपको 3 शब्दों में बोलूँगा. पहले के ज़माने में लोगों के पास वक्त था, फुर्सत थी और शौक थे. I think, unfortunately, where modern architecture is concerned, especially in India, or not modern architecture so much, but conservation of architecture is concerned, and looking at monuments as something more than just monuments or tourist destinations, I think somewhere we've lost that, but hopefully are now finding the way back, thanks to both of you.
I think, yeah, skills very, very important to continue to patronize and to encourage. And you mentioned lime workshops. We're also doing lime workshops on every site that we have, so that people can relearn or remember the values of working with lime and mortar than with cement. So that's very important. Also, I think talking to so many architects, there are only, I'm told this number may be right or wrong, 400 conservation architects in the country. And there aren't any more than that. So, so don't we need more architects? If you're going to be a World Heritage destination, you need to have that much more focus on creating talent that is going to be able to conserve, to maintain, and to restore these places. So what are we going to do about that? So it is about, sort of architects, it's about conservation skills, it's about, sort of really reliving our history and making sure that our craftsmen, sort of continue to be patronized. And I think that's a very good term you used. We have to patronize them over, sort of something that is coming, which is cheaper perhaps and quicker. And I keep telling that to people too, that, we're looking at buildings and restoring structures that are 500 years old or 1,000 years old. Any of the modern structures that you have will not last more than 50 years. They'll have to be brought down and something new will have to come.
One monument in India you think is misunderstood?
It's so it's a cultural heritage also. It's not just monuments. And I mentioned Khotachi Wadi already. So Khotachi Wadi for me is a place which is misunderstood because it is taken to be just a precinct. But it is really a living memory. It's something that we have to recall, that it's not just a monument, but what is the history of that place and what, so what went into the making of that monument. That is sometimes forgotten, perhaps maybe not misunderstood, but certainly forgotten.
Thank you. Anuradha ji.
I think most of them are actually, as long as it's not a practicing temple or a mosque or a church, they're misunderstood. So if you have a public building which is converted into a hospital, it's misunderstood because they say, this is an old building, how can it give you modern facilities? Without knowing that the oldest hospital in London is about 1,200 years old. So I think any building which is not in use as a religious site in India is misunderstood.
So World Monuments Fund is doing projects all across the globe. A project anywhere in the world that you think India can learn from?
So there are again several examples. I won't tell you a project that we can learn from. I can tell you that there's something that we're doing here that the world is learning from, and certainly World Monuments Fund globally is also learning from, is our projects in the stepwells and the water bodies of India. So that's something that we are now sharing with the world. So yeah, so not what we can learn from others, but what we can teach others about.
I would say, the two, and because she said the stepwells and the water bodies, I was going to say the water management because that's key. But if it's not that, it would be Venice, because I think Venice has now learned how to deal with water, the pollution, the kind of pollution that the big, what are they called? The cruise ships bring in, the marine life. They're also doing architectural conservation and how that's affected the buildings because they're all underwater. The foundations are underwater. And they're also doing craft conservation and Murano at the same time. So if there's one place, I would say Venice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. And I would like to open the floor for questions now, please.
Thank you for the very wonderful talk and presentation. Just a off take. When you're mentioning about the monuments and people go and click photograph, but there is one thing where you find people putting their names, which they spoil. But in context to that, recent news are there that 2,000 years back, an Indian merchant as a tourist went to many sites and inscribed his name in Brahmi, which we are now taking as a historical. Just the two contrast. If you can just play something.
Very well said. Maybe 1,000 years later, Bubbly was here, will be remembered as heritage.
I guess that's all part of the monuments and the memory that they leave behind, right? Thank you.
Hi, my question is, I live in Delhi. Delhi's home. This morning when I woke up, I read a headline which said 4,000 some trees that were removed from the Central Vista area to accommodate the new buildings for the government, where they tore down old buildings, and not only buildings, my question is trees, which have been lost forever. What's your view on that as conservationists?
Trees are more important than buildings. They're absolutely, this is happening everywhere. It's not just in Delhi. I didn't know about this. I didn't read the papers this morning, but it happens everywhere. And this is what we deal with, even with buildings and, how they're torn down, and what you asked earlier is, I think that we need to, how much do you fight for? What do you do? And we need to keep at it, I suppose, in some way. But this is our heritage. The trees are our heritage. Every time I see an old tree, I think, how much has this tree seen? And now we know it's a known, proven fact that trees even communicate with each other. So are we killing a living being, and how do we justify it? We cannot. That's my take.
I completely agree with you on that.
Bastar region and other surfaces that they were there.
In fact, what was required was to cut the jungles, bring the roads over here, and bring civilization to them. And it was really a concerted effort for them to keep them backwards by this thing. So I think there has to be some balance between this, great environmental love, and on the other hand, progress of civilization and of modern amenities. You can't always, the moment say some trees were cut, the first word that comes to your mouth is criminal.
4,000 old trees in the middle of a city. And if there is a way the trees can be transplanted and moved somewhere, then that is fine. But what an old tree does I don't know, I'm assuming they're about 100 years old. But even if it is not 100 years old, it's 25 years old, the amount of pollution in a place like Delhi that tree will be absorbing, I think there will be ways of working around it. It's not 1 or 2 trees. The lady mentioned 4,000.
I think we've got to consider that, so when we're planning new cities, when we're planning urban development and growth, we have to take heritage into account when we're doing this urban management. That's one. And whether it is, of nature, and I think nature is as much heritage, if not more, than built heritage. And so we've got to take that into account, and we have to plan around it. If you're developing and planning new cities, new areas, new habitations, why can't we take spaces which are barren? Which don't have resources that can be exploited or need to be exploited, use that space for modern cultivation. In any case, construction, in any case, we're taking water from, we're creating irrigation canals and systems from all over the country. Use those systems. Yes.
No, absolutely. I think Bombay, there's a lot being spoken about right now in the Andamans with the sort of urban development and trees that are being cut there. So I think there has to be a balance between the ecological impact and the impact to us humans. I mean, I don't think we need to save the world. I think we need to save ourselves when we're talking about. I think we all feel passionately about nature and culture in our different ways. And I think we can continue this conversation once we're done with this discussion. I would like to, for the moment, thank my 2 speakers today for being so wonderful and giving us such lovely insights into the work that they're both doing. Thank you, Malini ji. Thank you, Anuradha ji.